Mahmoud Aziz, and I am the director for the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. Before we get to our talk and so many great things that our staff is doing, I would like to thank the sponsors and co-sponsors for this event, the School of Middle East and North African Studies, and also the School of Global Studies. I see Ben and Hussein here, so thank you very much for doing this. Our speaker today is Dr. Jessica Barnes, who is an associate professor in the Department of Geography at the University of South Carolina. Before I take the pleasure of introducing her, I would like to highlight two upcoming events for this month organized by the CMES. From October the 18th to October the 20th, CMES is collaborating with three other Title VI centers at the University of Arizona: Center for Latin American Studies, Center for East Asian Studies, and Center for Educational Resources on Culture, Language, and Literacy for a virtual workshop titled Teaching Less Commonly Taught Languages at Hispanic Serving Institutions. This workshop invites language experts across the United States to share evidence-based insights on how to help recruit and sustain enrollment in critical languages at Hispanic serving institutions. Invited speakers and presenters will provide strategies for student recruitment, retention, and success, and also discuss ways in which they have integrated AI, artificial intelligence, and other platforms into their classes. The workshop features four important panels: Hispanic serving institution missions, general trends in recruitment and enrollment, student retention strategies, and teaching and artificial intelligence in the pedagogies of less commonly taught languages. The event is free and open to the public. Please check the CMES website for how to register for this. The second event is on October the 30th. CMES is hosting an Iranian Halloween film screening titled A Girl Walk Home Alone at Night. It's going to be at the Integrated Learning Center, the ILC, in room 130. The discussant for this movie is Dr. Julie Allison. Thank you very much, Dr. Allison, for doing this. Tickets are being distributed on a first-come, first-served. Please communicate with Thomas Kenny if you are interested in getting a ticket. Now it's my great honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Dr. Jessica Barnes. Dr. Jessica Barnes is an associate professor with a joint appointment in the Department of Geography and the School of Earth, Ocean, and Environment at the University of South Carolina. Dr. Jessica Barnes holds a PhD in Sustainable Development with distinction from Columbia University. And before that, she obtained an MA in Environmental Management from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Her BA was in Geography, first class, from Oxford University. After obtaining her PhD, Dr. Jessica Barnes was a postdoc associate for 2 years at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and at the Yale Climate and Energy Institute. Her work examines the cultural, political, and material dimensions of resource use and environmental change in the Middle East and beyond. She has published several books, including Cultivating the Nile, The Everyday Politics of Water in Egypt with Duke University Press in 2014. She also published Climate Cultures, Anthropological Perspectives on Climate Change, co-edited with Michael Dove, published by Yale University Press in 2015. She also published Stable Security, Bread and Wheat in Egypt with Duke University Press in 2022, which will be the core of her conversation and talk today. In addition to these books, she has published around 20 articles in top-tier journals in her field, including the British Journal of Middle East Studies, the British Journal of Middle East Studies and Geographical Review, Ethnography, and International Journal of Middle East Studies, just to name a few. Her academic production also includes 6 edited journal special issues over the past 10 years. Some of these are Nature and Politics, Environment and Society in the Middle East and North Africa, and Environmental Futures. These came out in the journals of Middle East Studies Report, a journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute, Social Sciences, and the International Journal of Middle East Studies. With a stellar academic record, Dr. Barnes was the winner of over 10 awards and distinctions. These include the 2024 Education Foundation Award in the Humanities and Social Sciences by the University of South Carolina, the University of South Carolina Book Award, Geographies of Food and Agriculture, that's the specialty group of the American Association of Geographers, and the prestigious American Council of Learned Societies Fellowship, ALC. She also secured an outstanding number of grants for her research program. These included the 2024 Cultural Anthropology Program Senior Research Award, the National Science Foundation Grant, the Wenner-Gren Foundation Grant, and the Excel Grant by the University of South Carolina. Dr. Barnes gave invited talks about her research program at multiple institutions, including the London School of Economics and Political Science, King's College London, University of Wisconsin-Madison, SOAS, University of London, Rice University, University of Virginia, the George Washington University, and Georgetown University, to name just recent ones. Dr. Barnes is currently developing a new project on air pollution in London, which examines how air pollution is woven into the fabric of daily lives in racialized and class-inflected ways. Dr. Barnes' talk this afternoon is titled Stable Security, Bread and Wheat in Egypt. As some of you know, Egypt's wheat supply is largely dependent on imports, and Russia and Ukraine previously accounted for 86% of this wheat. Due to the ongoing war in Ukraine, the government has had to look for alternatives and has frequently highlighted this issue as a national security concern. In this talk, Dr. Barnes will explore the anxiety that pervades Egyptian society surrounding the possibility that the nation could run out of wheat or that people might not have enough food to eat. Linking global flows of grain and the National Bread Subsidy Program with everyday household practices, she will examine the daily efforts to ensure this and how this could stop in the future. She will also offer a novel conceptualization of the nexus between food and security, focusing attention on stable food as a form of security. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Barnes.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here. Thanks to Julie for her incredible logistics support and getting it all organised. And thank you all for coming. I'm really sort of thrilled to be here and to have a chance to share my recent book with you. So when Egyptian protesters took to the streets in January 2011, they called for bread, freedom, and social justice. Now, bread here was in part symbolic. It was a reference to people's livelihoods, to their inability to build decent lives for themselves. But it was also literal. Some protesters carried loaves of bread in their hands, others fashioned helmets out of bread. They were calling for bread because bread is food that most Egyptians eat every day, 3 times a day. They were calling for bread because the years prior had seen severe shortages in the supply of the very widely eaten government-subsidised bread, as well as complaints about quality. And to the protesters, these deficiencies were really emblematic of the Mubarak regime's shortcomings. So as a staple food, we can't understand bread without thinking about the staple crop from which it's made, wheat. Egypt grows a lot of wheat, mostly on pretty small-scale farms, just an acre or 2 in size. But Egyptian farmers can't grow enough to meet their country's very high demand for bread. So about half the nation's wheat supply is imported. Now, to Egyptians, the possibility that their nation could run out of wheat, or that they might not have decent bread to eat, is an existential threat. It's a threat to the well-being of Egypt's poor, for whom cheap bread constitutes a major portion of their caloric intake, and it's a threat to the stability of the state. So history has shown how people don't sit idly by when they don't have good bread to eat. In my book, I introduce this concept of stable security to describe the practices through which people seek to counter this threat and ensure the continuous supply of a palatable staple on the level of the nation, but also on the level of a household. So just to take each part of this concept in turn, by staple what I mean is a food that defines a meal. A staple is the kind of food that if it's not on the table, people don't feel like they've properly eaten. So I remember back in 2008, a time when I was doing field work in Egypt, and this was a time of severe bread shortages, where sometimes bakeries were running out of bread, people were standing in long lines, 2-3 hours, sometimes getting to the end of the line and finding there wasn't any bread. And a man said to me, I went to the bakery this morning and I couldn't, there was no bread left. And he said, I couldn't bring bread for my children today, they won't have anything to eat. And I was really struck by this, because by that he didn't mean literally that his children wouldn't eat anything all day, rather that without bread, they wouldn't be properly nourished. So as one of my Egyptian friends once said to me, it's impossible to last a day without bread. Bread is something fundamental. And I know that a lot of you work in the Middle East, so perhaps this idea won't seem so sort of foreign to you. You know, certainly this is the case in many Middle Eastern countries, the sort of central significance of bread in diets. And there are a lot of parallels we could talk about or think about in other parts of the world, if you think of rice, for example, in some East Asian countries. So staple security brings together this one particular kind of food with the notion of security, an idea, a theme that political scientists have long been interested in, but which recently has been taken up more broadly by anthropologists and geographers. This work has expanded conceptualizations of security beyond just kind of national concerns about policing borders or maintaining stability, to really think about how security infuses daily life. So Colloquium defines security as a modality of constructing danger, enemies, fear, and anxiety, and the measures taken to guard against such constructed threats. What I find useful about this definition is that it points to these two dimensions of security. On the one hand, you have the affective dimension, the lived experience of fear and risk. On the other hand, you have the actions that people are taking to address those perceived threats. And these dimensions are obviously interlinked. Actions may lead to a momentary state of security in which those feelings of anxiety give way to those of reassurance and comfort, but the threat is ever present. I introduced this idea of staple security as a deliberate point of departure from the much discussed concept of food security. This is because I see food security as tied and rooted to a very particular history of kind of international conferences, negotiated definitions like this one, and policy approaches. One of the things that I found really interesting in this work is that despite the inclusion of the word security in the term, explorations of security itself have been remarkably lacking. So food security tells us little about the very deep anxieties that surround efforts to obtain particular foods, or what might happen in their absence. So this kind of bland definition about people being able to access food stands in stark contrast with that square in downtown Cairo thronging with protesters. Food security also isn't very helpful for thinking about staples specifically, even though actually staple grains were the focus of much of the early work in this field. As you can see from this definition, nutritional balance is now a key part of how scholars think about food security. You can't be food secure just from eating bread. And this was brought home for me during my field work when I found that all the people who are working on food security issues in Egypt never talked about bread, except to sometimes say that they thought that Egyptians ate too much bread. And all the people working on bread and wheat issues never framed their work in terms of food security. So there's this kind of disconnect between how policy scholars are thinking about food security and how people actually experience security related to a particular food. So staple security allows me to kind of move beyond this, to move beyond work on food security, to really think about this nexus between food and security. It focuses attention on staple foods because these foods are unlike others in their existential importance to people's lives and to the stability of the state and the legitimacy of the state. This is why their absence or their substandard quality poses such a threat. Now, of course, this is a constructed threat. It is possible to live without bread. We all know that. But as we also know, security isn't really about the assessment of real dangers. It's a kind of an imaginary. So the affective dimension of staple security captures both a political leader's fear of the bread riot and that kind of unsettled feeling a parent has when there's no bread left in the home. It also captures other forms of affect, the pleasure of eating a meal with freshly baked bread, or the yearning for breads that taste of rural childhoods. People care what this bread tastes like. The other dimension of staple security is the concrete actions through which people seek to secure the presence of that tasty staple. And these range from the government's operation of a huge food subsidy program to small individual acts within the home, like how people handle leftover loaves at the end of a meal. So the book draws on ethnographic research that I've done in Egypt since 2007, in rural Egypt in a village that I call Warda in Fayoum province, which is a couple of hours southwest of Cairo, as well as interviews, archival research, and analysis of Arabic language newspapers. It also draws on ethnographic research that I did in collaboration with a research assistant, Mariam Tahar, at bakeries in Cairo in 2015 through 2017. In my talk today, I want to give you 3 examples to illustrate this idea of stable security. In each example, we see the relationship between wheat, bread, and the body, but the nature of the body shifts across them, from the body of the Egyptian nation to the body of the household to the body of an individual. My first case is about the Egyptian government's procurement of foreign wheat. The second is about accessing government-subsidized bread in Cairo. And the third is about maintaining the quality of homemade bread in a rural household. The language of security is very explicit at the national level, but it kind of fades as we move down to the household. But the underlying rationale remains. Individuals are just as concerned about the supply of bread as the state is. So while these actions that I'm going to talk about seem quite, on the face of it, quite different, they're each in their own ways part of this effort to ensure that Egyptians have good bread to eat every day. I bring together these kind of scales and sites because it's through these everyday practices taking place at in fields, at ports, in silos, bakeries, and within the home, that this feeling of security reaches the bellies of the Egyptian people. So my first example is about the procurement of foreign wheat. As I said, Egypt relies on imports for about half its wheat needs. This makes Egypt one of the largest importers of wheat in the world. About half this imported wheat is imported by a government agency known as GAS for use in the production of subsidized bread. The remainder is imported by the private sector for the use in kind of specialty breads and cakes and pasta. I'll talk more about this subsidized bread shortly, but just briefly, the government has been subsidizing one particular kind of bread since the 1940s, known as baladi bread. And while the government also procures a lot of the government does also procure a lot of wheat from Egyptian farmers. Without imported wheat, there wouldn't be enough flour to make subsidized bread for the kind of 70 million or so people who eat it on a daily basis. Egyptians are very aware of the nation's reliance on imported wheat, and it's something that many people worry about. One day I was chatting with a woman called Leila in her home in Warda. Leila's in her late 20s, smart and curious. We were talking about baking bread and farming wheat, elements of Leila's day-to-day experience. I was slightly surprised when, slightly without any prompting, she said to me, "You know, Egypt has to import wheat." And it was very clear from her tone that she didn't see this as being a good thing. And she went on to suggest that Egypt should reclaim more desert land and use this for growing wheat. Then, she said, we'd produce enough wheat for ourselves. That Leila would mention this to me is, I think, revealing. She often talks about things going on in the news, but her world is far removed from that of grain policy making in Cairo. In fact, she's never been to Cairo. But she still has an opinion on policy decisions being made about wheat. It matters to her that Egypt isn't self-reliant. To her, it's a marker of national weakness. We see similar perspectives in newspaper commentaries, this sense that relying on others for your food means you don't own your freedom, or the fear that comes from being subject to the whims of others to send you wheat. The concern is that something might happen that would mean that Egypt couldn't get the wheat that it needs from overseas. If prices went up, the government ran out of money, or if politics influenced trade flows, all of which, as we heard in the introduction, have actually happened in the last couple of years with the war in Ukraine. And I'm happy to talk about this more in the discussion if people are interested. The sense of vulnerability comes not just from the possibility that the wheat supply could be interrupted, but also because of concerns about the quality of imported wheat. Fears about bad wheat from overseas abound. One newspaper article referred to shipments arriving at Egyptian ports as carrying one of the worst kinds of wheat in the world, only fit for animals. And this wheat isn't being fed to animals at all. It's being fed to the people through their daily bread. In an interview with two Cairo-based food activists, they asked me if I'd heard about the scandals surrounding bad wheat from Russia. They actually couldn't remember any of the details. They just thought it had something to do with carcinogens, but they were really clear on their association of Russian wheat with danger. But the government doesn't just let any old wheat into the country. It sets regulations and it has a whole inspection process to ensure that the imported wheat meets them. Still, there's a politics to what exactly comprise these regulations and how they're enforced. This is part of what staple security is at a national level. It's about mediating how much and what kind of wheat enters Egypt, both of which impact how much and what kind of bread the state is able to subsidise. So to illustrate this, I want to tell you about a controversy in recent years over a fungus in wheat called ergot. We might commonly think about a fungus that's found on grain as a threat to national security, but actually that's just how the Egyptian government saw it. In December 2015, the Egyptian inspectors turned away a 63,000-ton shipment of French wheat from the port of Damietta, sending shockwaves through the global wheat industry. The wheat had been purchased by gas from Bunge, one of the world's major grain trading companies. The reason for the rejection was the wheat's contamination with ergot. Ergot is a common fungus found on grain around the world, but it's highly toxic to humans and animals and can cause severe health problems, even death. According to the Codex Alimentarius, which is an internationally adopted set of food safety guidelines, 0.05% is the key threshold, the maximum level of ergot contamination that's deemed not to pose a health risk. This is a standard that the US uses. But in rejecting the French shipment, the Egyptian inspectors were calling for a more stringent zero tolerance. They did this in part because a number of Egyptian officials are worried that imported grain carrying ergot could contaminate Egyptian fields, which at the moment don't have a problem with this fungus. This could jeopardize domestic wheat cultivation because the fungus reduces grain yields and thereby affect the supply of flour for bread production. Officials are also concerned about the potential impacts on human health. One member of parliament described ergot contamination as a national security issue because, she said, it affects the health of a large number of citizens and can lead to permanent disability or death. A number of commentators drew on the high consumption of bread by Egyptians to support this move towards zero tolerance. One agricultural professor, for example, drew a comparison between the Egyptian citizen, who eats 182 kilograms of bread a year, and the European citizen, who consumes only 60, concluding that Egyptians are liable to a very dangerous rate of damage, not comparable to those that faced by others. But the government was in a tricky situation, because it has to get wheat from somewhere. And ergot is so common in most of the major wheat-producing countries, so we have it here in the US, for example. Government officials went kind of back and forth with various experts weighing in on the risks. But in the end, they decided to reverse their stance. Not because they concluded that ergot didn't pose a safety risk, but because traders said that they wouldn't sell wheat to Egypt if the government insisted on zero tolerance. Such an expectation, they claimed, was just unreasonable. As one European trader said, no country anywhere in the world can provide wheat with zero ergot in bulk volume. When I talked about this case with a grain trade expert, he explained that the government decided to conform with the international standard because otherwise there would be a problem with the supply. So the government is always trying to juggle its concerns about the quality of imported wheat with the imperative to maintain a continual supply of flour for the subsidised bread programme. When that supply is threatened, the government sometimes has to compromise on quality. In 2018, ergot returned to the news again when officials found that a shipment of Russian wheat contained 0.06% ergot, just above that threshold, and they rejected it. Russia responded with a swift denial and sent a delegation to Egypt. Following further testing of samples in Cairo, officials revised their claims, announcing that the levels were within the acceptable limits and releasing the wheat into the country. This struck me as curious. Was the change in decision actually related to new testing results or pressure exerted by the Russian delegation? Or could it have been driven by the government's need for grain at that particular point in time? When I interviewed a grain trading expert later that year, I asked him why the government had changed its mind on this Russian shipment. He smiled and corrected me. They didn't change their mind, he said. They retested it. He spoke with kind of conviction, but his following statement undermined the apparent neutrality of this testing process. The problem is, he said, that some inspectors are stricter. So in this first example, we see this sense of threat, a threat that Egypt might not have enough wheat for its subsidised bread programme, or that some of the wheat being turned into flour and baked into loaves could be contaminated. And these are threats that are talked about explicitly in terms of national security. And we also see the response, a wrangling over import regulations between government officials, agricultural experts, grain traders and inspectors, who all have slightly different interests. This is an example of what stable security means at the kind of national level. My next two examples take us down to the household and to what is sort of ultimately at stake here, bread. So my second case is about the government-subsidised bread known as baladi bread, which is eaten by most Egyptians on a daily basis. This is a pita-style bread made with dark, brown-rich flour, produced from a mix of imported and domestic wheat. It's produced largely in small-scale, privately owned bakeries, like this one. And for people with ration cards, it costs 20 piastres a loaf. That's less than a half a US cent, and a fraction of the cost of any other kind of bread in the market. Now, actually, up until June of this year, a loaf of bread cost 5 piastres, which would be the same price it had been for 35 years. And I'm actually not entirely sure why the government made the decision at this juncture to increase the price, but I presume it was some combination of the fact that wheat imports have been becoming increasingly expensive in recent years, and also the international financial institutions have been putting pressure on Egypt to increase the price of bread for decades. So they finally did, with this quite significant price increase, but still, if you compare that to the cost of what it's estimated to cost to produce a loaf of bread, it's still a very significant subsidy. So the estimated cost of production is 125 piastres. So being able to buy it for 20 is still quite cheap. So in the past, there have been some moments of severe shortages in the supply of baladi bread, like in 2007 and 2008 during the global food crisis, where you had these long lines and bakeries were running out of bread. And there were a number of cases of kind of fights breaking out of bakeries. A few people died. And there was a lot of anger around this. As a result, kind of after the revolution, the governments of first President Morsi and then President Sisi sought to reform the subsidy program to address some of these issues around bread scarcity. So in 2014, the government basically changed the way the subsidy program operates. And there were a number of different dimensions to these reforms, which again I can talk about later if of interest. But just in short, they were quite successful. Today it's really quite rare for bakeries to run out of bread. No longer do you find long lines, and many people say that the bread tastes better. The reform that I want to talk about is the introduction of an electronic smart card to mediate access to this bread. Before this time, anyone, even someone like me, could go up to a bakery and get bread at the cheap price. Since 2014, to get a loaf of bread for the low price, you have to have one of these cards which proves your eligibility. Economists might refer to this as a shift from a universal subsidy to a targeted subsidy, but actually the eligibility criteria is sufficiently broad that still the vast majority of Egyptians, around 70% of the population, so not just the poorest of the poor, remain eligible for this bread. So to get baladi bread today, what you do is you pay in cash, and at the same time you hand over your smart card, which the baker puts inside a little kind of handheld card reader, which logs how many loaves you're buying and keeps track of your allocation. Each person is entitled to 5 loaves of bread a day. So if you're a family of 6, you can get 30 loaves a day. And if you don't want that much bread, you can exchange any unused bread points for other subsidised goods like flour, like rice or sugar or tea. Some bakeries will still sell you bread if you don't have a smart card, but instead of paying 20 piastres, you'll have to pay closer to the cost of production, so probably over 100. Or you can go to a different kind of bakery and buy a non-subsidised bread, which costs much more. So these prices are all out of date, but I just keep them here just to give you some sense of the kind of the price difference, sort of how very much cheaper subsidised bread is from any other bread you can potentially get. So the smart card has become the means of accessing cheap, balloty bread. To get one of these smart cards requires a particular kind of labouring with the bureaucracy, standing in lines not at the bakery, but in various government offices. Once you have a smart card, you have to do certain things to make sure that the smart card keeps working. I see these efforts of accessing and maintaining the smart card as everyday practices of staple security at an individual level. They too are ways of people making sure that they have cheap bread to eat. So I want to now tell you a story about a woman I'll call Faiza and her card. This is a story about bureaucracy that will probably be very familiar to any of you who've had a frustrating day at the DMV in the past. In telling you this long and frustrating story, I want to offer a glimpse into what it's like to live in a world where access to a food that you rely on for 3 meals a day is mediated by bureaucratic lines and paperwork. Faiza is a widow in her 60s who lives with her 3 adult children, granddaughter and sister in a small 2-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighbourhood of Cairo. This is her local Market Street. She's someone my research assistant, Miriam, has known since her childhood. Faiza has a small pension from her deceased husband and also does some occasional cooking or childcare work, but no one in her household has a permanent full-time job. Sometimes she buys non-subsidised kinds of bread, which some of her members of her family actually prefer, but mostly she relies on balloty bread. Early in 2016, Faiza becomes sick. This was right in the middle of my collaborative fieldwork with Miriam. Unable to leave her apartment, Faiza doesn't use her smart card for several weeks. When her health improves, she goes to the bakery to get bread, only to find that her card has been deactivated. Over the following months, Faiza goes through the steps of trying to reactivate her card or get a new one several times. Each time she tells Miriam about the hours she has spent in bureaucratic offices, filling out forms, paying fees, and submitting paperwork. We keep a log in our field notes of the attempts and also their lack of success. Faiza complains, they keep sending me to different places, different offices. No one takes responsibility. As an elderly person who finds it difficult to move about, she finds these busy offices challenging places to be. I'm an old woman. Why do they have to make me run all around just to get bread? By the time Miriam finishes her fieldwork, late in 2017, Faiza still hasn't got a card. She continues having to buy bread at a much higher price or sometimes rely on subsidised loads that her friends will give her if they have a few extra. While the problem was precipitated by her not using her card for a few weeks, her sense of vulnerability without it is palpable. She has enough money to occasionally buy non-subsidised bread, but it makes a difference when she can't get subsidised goods for months on end. So prices of most things have been really ratcheting up in Egypt in recent years. There's been huge inflation since the government devalued its currency in 2017, and then more price increases recently with the COVID pandemic and the Ukraine war. And in this context, cheap bread really provides an important safety net. In September 2018, when Miriam returns to Egypt after some time overseas, she offers to accompany Faiza to the local office of the Ministry of Supply, which is the government agency that manages the subsidy programme. When they arrive just after 9 a.m, the office isn't yet open, but there's little groups of people everywhere. The women have organised themselves in an order, taking names in a numbered list. Faiza is 41st on the women's list. Around 9:30, the metal shutters are pulled up and the service windows appear. Immediately, the crowds swarm. There's constant activity at the window, women waving papers, plastic folders and cards, shouting and pushing, but little movement in the line. An hour later, number 20 has moved only a few feet forward. Suddenly, 2 new windows open up and Miriam and Faiza make their way over through the crowds. But when they talk to the clerk, he tells Faiza that all her information has gone from the system and she has to do all the paperwork again. He gives her a list of instructions and sends her them off to other offices to get more documentation. They set off around Cairo, following these instructions in search of paper. At the second office they go to, Faiza is told that she doesn't actually need these documents and given another set of instructions completely different to the first. 4 hours, 3 offices, 3 taxi rides, many lines later, and still no card. A week later, they try again, this time going to another local branch of the Ministry of Supply where they think that there might be fewer people. When they arrive just before 9, it's less crowded than the other office was. Pfizer is number 11 on the list. They stand in line, occasionally moving forwards, most of the time mobile. When they get to the front and explain their situation, the clerk tells them that Pfizer needs to get a form from the next window, and they move to the back of that window sign. It's now 9:55 and getting hot. Bodies are pressing in on all sides, pouncing at any opportunity to move forward. Around Miriam, everyone is asking questions, unsure of the process. Is this where I get the form? Are you applying for a card as well? These kind of nuggets of information circulate through the crowd, collected eagerly by those who are waiting as they seek to piece together how exactly the system works. Eventually, they get to the front. The clerk starts going through Pfizer's papers, but notices a problem. She needs to file a report at the police station to get proof that she no longer has a card. Determined to make progress, they decide to go to a police office nearby and get this done, then return to the office to stand in line again. When it's Pfizer's turn, she presents her papers once more. The woman goes through them, fills them out, and staples everything together. She tells them that they have to take these papers to another window. I told you this was quite a long and frustrating story. They join a line at yet another window, but it's not moving. It turns that the computer system is down. One woman in the line, who's also waiting for a new card, finds that she feels lucky. Her husband knows the owner of a bakery, and he lets them take 10 loaves a day. If she had to wait for her card before she could get cheap bread, she wouldn't be able to manage. This food is key to her household's food security. After a while, the system begins working and the line starts edging forward. At last, it's Pfizer's turn, and she hands over her paperwork. The clerk glances through the documents and tells her, apologetically, that she's at the wrong office. She has to go to the office that she's zoned for. Tired and fed up, Pfizer and Miriam decide to go that day to finish the process. They return to the same office they went to on the previous occasion, which luckily is calmer on this day, with only 20 or so people lining up outside. At the window, the clerk flicks through Pfizer's documents, stamps some papers, and says the process is complete. She'll receive a text message when her card is ready. It could take 15 days or up to 3 months. 9 months later, Pfizer finally receives her card. But she never receives the PIN number that she needs to activate it, which is meant to be delivered by text message. After multiple trips to offices to ask, she finds out that the number on record for her is out of date. She has to go to a mobile phone store and buy a SIM card for her old number, but isn't sure what to do next. When Miriam returns to Cairo for a visit in September 2019, she offers to put some money on Pfizer's phone so they can try sending a message to receive this PIN. Miriam types in the number but is unable to send an empty message as required, because on this phone, the icon for sending a message only comes up if you've got some text already typed in the composition box. Eventually, frustrated, Miriam types in, where is the PIN number, and presses send. Several minutes later, to both their surprise, the phone buzzes. The screen shows a 4-digit code and notification that Pfizer's card will be operational by October the 4th at the latest. And sure enough, in early October, Pfizer's card stops working, and the nearly 4-year-long saga comes to an end. Pfizer's story isn't unique. This was a tent set up in Cairo in March 2019 for people whose cars had been stopped for a number of reasons who wanted to lodge complaints. Pfizer talks about her friend, who's a widow with 2 disabled children, who's been waiting to receive a new card for a year and can barely get by in the meantime. She describes another woman who lives with her husband and 4 children in the small space under the stairs of the apartment building where he's the doorman. They've been waiting 2 years for their card. Both this woman and her husband are illiterate and struggle with navigating the government bureaucracy. She talks about another man she met one day in the Ministry of Supply office who was dizzy and tired. He had submitted all his paperwork, made multiple payments, been told numerous times that his card was on its way, but had been waiting for 6 months. Everyone has a story, Pfizer says, a long, sad story. So difficult. So the line has shifted from the highly politicized and much photographed space of the bakery to the less visible and more sparsely media coverage space of the bureaucratic office. In the process, opaque bureaucratic procedures have created a new set of barriers to bread access that work to disadvantage those with low levels of literacy, who are unfamiliar with using online systems, or don't have the time or the physical strength to spend hours at busy government offices. While this bread line is kind of a clear symbol of systemic failure and individual humiliation, in offices and mobile phone networks, these conditions are less tangible, but still present. For an elderly person like Pfizer, or for the almost 1/3 of the Egyptian adult population that is illiterate, an inability to navigate the system brings not only frustration, but a sense of shame. So what Pfizer's story illustrates is that even when a government spends so much money procuring good quality wheat and subsidising a staple such that its price is sufficiently low as to be affordable to all, its bureaucratic procedures may impede access. Getting bread for a family, therefore, can require many different forms of practice. Dealing with paperwork may be just as important as going to the bakery. My final example of staple security takes us within the home and shifts from an urban to a rural context to look at people who also eat bread every day but don't have to wait in long lines to do so because they bake it themselves. In this example, people aren't explicitly invoking security, but that's the affective orientation underpinning their labours. In this example, we see how the nexus between food and security is also found in everyday practices of handling food in the home. So in Borda, the area where I've been conducting research since 2007, many households bake their own bread from homegrown wheat. In this area, they make these large round flat loaves. In other parts of the country, they make slightly different kinds of bread. Through the production of homemade bread, farming households consume about 60% of the domestic wheat harvest. So this is all wheat that doesn't then go into the circulation to be used in the subsidised bread programme. Baking bread takes a lot of time, and there's a whole other story I could tell about how women find the flour and labour necessary to produce their own bread. But this isn't something they do every day. Typically they'll bake maybe once every 3 or 4 weeks with a very large quantity of flour at a time, maybe 50 kilograms of flour or so. Instead of looking at this occasional labour of baking, I want to focus on the daily labour of managing bread within a home. These tasks may be small, but I'd argue that they're key to ensuring that people in these rural households have a satisfactory staple to eat. And just as a side note, this is a gendered labour. So it's women who are primarily responsible for handling bread in the home, but men do play a key role in other ways. So in the rural context, for example, men typically take primary responsibility for wheat cultivation, and in urban areas, it's often men who will be the ones who go to the bakery to get the bread. Homemade bread is made of just 4 ingredients: flour, water, salt, and yeast. It doesn't have any additional preservatives. This means that the bread requires careful management if it's to remain edible for the month after it's been baked. Women in the village use 2 preservation techniques: freezing and drying. After baking, they'll cut their bread into quarters and divide it into 2 piles. The first pile they keep as what they call soft bread, aish curry, and some of this bread they'll leave out on a tray or in the fridge to eat over the next day or 2. The remainder they'll freeze. So most families in the village have a small refrigerator top freezer compartment. Freezing stops the bread from becoming mouldy, but when it comes time to eat, a particular kind of care work is required to make these frozen loaves palatable. It's a winter evening just after sunset, and 2 teenage girls in Borda are in the courtyard of their home. The stars are coming out in the clear dark sky, and there's a chill in the air. The girls are crouched beside a metal bowl full of coals. All around the village, you'll see these glows of coals outside houses as families get ready for their evening meal. One by one, the women take loaves from the pile beside them and lay them onto the flames. They watch the ice crystals disappear as the loaves transform from stiff to flexible. They turn each quarter over once or twice to make sure that the thicker edge of the loaf, as well as the thinner middle part, defrost. They then take the bread off the flames before it changes colour. They want to thaw it from its frozen state, not toast it to a crisp. Once they work their way through a pile of 20 or so quarters, they wrap the bread in a cloth and bring it through to the table, ready as dinner is served. So we don't often consider these kinds of everyday domestic practices alongside things like national import regulations or a government subsidy programme. But what I'm trying to show here is the connections between them. These dynamics are all taking place at different scales and involve different actors who have contrasting interests. But they're all in their own ways about people working to ensure that there's enough good bread to eat. The other part style of bread that women divide off on baking days is for what they call dry bread, Eichenärsche. This isn't a dryness of staleness, it's a dryness that's specifically produced to prolong the bread's life. Marwa has just finished baking. She examines each loaf in turn as she cuts them into quarters. The thin and soft ones we eat fresh, she says, the rest we dry. She turns down the heat of her gas oven, which she's been using for baking, and starts putting the bread back in. Bismillah, in the name of God, she said before she puts in each piece. So whereas the girls I just talked about were heating frozen loaves on a hot fire to eat immediately, she's drying fresh loaves in a warm oven to eat at some point in the future. She carefully moves the quarters around different parts of the oven, taking them out every so often and feeling them, squeezing the thicker parts to see if they have any remaining softness. She balances some loaves upright near the mouth of the oven to dry out their last side. When the bread is finally fully dry, she lays it carefully on a metal dish. Once in this dry state, the bread can last for 2 months without any need for wrapping or covering. An open cardboard box like this will do. So when it comes to eating, sometimes people will just eat it like this dry, so almost like a cracker. Other times they might sprinkle some water on it or briefly immerse it in water to soften it. This doesn't make the bread soft like fresh bread, but it makes it less stiff and more pliable, which is important because when people eat with this bread, they'll typically pull off pieces and use them to fold them to scoop up a sauce or eat some salad. As well as these practices of maintaining the quality of homemade bread, women's ways of handling bread within the home are also designed to ensure that none is wasted. At the end of a meal, for example, women will dust off any leftover bread, pat it clean, and place it to the side to serve at the next meal. This is in part because there's a cultural norm against throwing away bread, but it's also because people have an interest in not wasting a staple food that they've invested so much in producing. These women don't talk about their household work in terms of security, but their day-to-day acts are just as significant for ensuring that they have their desired staple to eat. They know that without bread, the meals they're presenting to their families, which in many cases comprise of little other than bread, will be insufficient. A bit of fermented cheese, some olives, some eggplant won't fill the belly if it's not accompanied by bread. And these families can't afford rice or pasta more than once a week. Given that they're eating bread 3 times a day, it's also not surprising that people care about what the bread tastes like. So the threat in this case isn't so much about there not being any bread to eat at all, but there not being good bread to eat. In the case of the extended family that I used to live next to in this village, for example, there's a strong preference for homemade bread, which household members perceive as being better, cleaner, healthier, tastier than purchased breads. So they could go and get subsidised bread if they ran out of homemade bread, if, for example, the women didn't freeze or dry sufficient to last them through to the next baking day. But they don't like to do this. I remember one meal that I was sharing with them when the male head of the family kind of complained about the subsidised bread that the women placed on the table and told them, bake, you've got to bake soon, you can't eat this bread. So women's efforts not only to bake homemade bread, but also to maintain the quality and prevent wastage within the home, are all about making sure that they have decent bread to put on the table. They're all these techniques of securing the staple. To conclude then, while on the face of it, a controversy over a fungus in a grain, a frustrating experience of working through bureaucratic steps to get a smart card, and the handling of bread within a rural home might appear to have little in common, they're united by a staple food. The reason why ergot is so controversial is because the wheat that it's found in is destined for use in subsidised bread, and also because it threatens domestic wheat cultivation, which is also key for bread production. The reason why the smart card bureaucracy is significant is because it mediates who's able to access cheap bread. The reason why freezing, drying, and saving scraps of bread in the home are notable is because they're fundamental to a family having good bread to eat. Staple security, therefore, offers a frame through which to analyse these complex dynamics together. At the level of the nation, city, and household, we see the deep anxieties about bread scarcity, the desires for bread quality, and these ongoing efforts to meet these perceived needs. We see this nexus of food and security. And it's within this realm of lived experience, in these everyday practices of staple security, that we see what ultimately shapes Egyptians' access to their daily bread. Thank you.
additional question, because when you mentioned that most households can't afford pasta or rice
Yes.
once a week, I had always thought of, and I only visited as a tourist for the shorter time, Egypt, but I had always thought of koshari as one of the foods that I saw, but that's pasta and rice.
Yeah.
So is that outside the realm of a lot of households' possibility now?
Well, there might be an urban-rural difference there. None of the rural households ate koshari as a regular thing. And I was thinking it was because when they cook rice, they often use a meat broth, and they can't afford meat more than once a meal. I actually don't know, I know koshari is a popular street food, but how much people in urban households are cooking it on a daily basis, I'm not sure. That would be interesting, yeah. But it's relatively much more expensive than bread. All those ingredients, yeah.
And thank you so much for this fabulous talk. I just want to ask, have you ever observed any food waste, especially of the heavily subsidized bread in Egypt? Because in Morocco, people keep talking about staple insecurity. But at the same time, it seems to me it's an irony that lots of people are wasting the heavily subsidized foods every day to feed birds, and even they waste their couscous, which is even more valuable food. And it's very popular in the urban areas in Morocco, such as Casablanca, Tangier, everywhere. So I was wondering, have you ever observed any food waste? I mean, bread waste?
I think it's interesting. It depends a bit on how you define food waste.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think that people feeding bread to their chickens is waste, then that does sometimes happen. But I would remind you that's not necessarily waste because it's still part of the household food production. But interesting you saying that was actually that's a common narrative in Egypt, that before these reforms in 2014, before they introduced the smart card, people were taking large quantities of bread and feeding it all to their chickens or to their poultry, and that's a common narrative. And I'm sure that did on occasion happen, but I suspect it wasn't nearly as prevalent as people were saying. And in terms of other kinds of food waste, no, bread waste, no, really people are that's what I gave the example within the home. And even one of the things we write about in the chapter, and Sophia Robbins has written about this in Palestine too, about actually there are all these practices, if you have extra bread, of people leaving it out in public spaces so that other people might take it. So there's really quite a taboo in Egypt against throwing away bread. That's why, at the end of the meal, even like a half-eaten bit of bread, people would never throw it away. If it's really kind of mangled, then maybe they would give it to their birds. But otherwise, they'll just dust it off and serve it for the next meal. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Now, I was wondering about that too, because in Iran, bread is a sign of God's blessing, and so you couldn't throw it away, or that would be just beyond the pale. So people would save it for animals, and that was considered entirely appropriate.
Yeah.
And even in Tucson, when I had relatives from Iran visiting, and my kids were at the age that they didn't want to get the crust on American bread, we had to save it all, and once or twice a week we'd go to the park and feed it to the ducks. But there was no throwing out of any bread.
Yeah. That is fascinating. And I guess in my view, I can totally see that logic. Like it's not wasteful. It's another species. But you can also see from the government bureaucrats' perspective, when they are subsidising it to such a high level, I can see their perspective on that. That's the intended recipient of their subsidy. Yeah, fascinating.
Thank you for the talk. I have two quick questions. One is, as far as I know, during the Ottoman Empire and even maybe during the Roman Empire, Egypt was always seen as the wheat barn of the empire.
Yeah.
The population increased drastically in the 19th century and stuff. But people talk about like this agricultural policy changes of government? Like for example, they started to produce a lot of cotton, and they become a big textile industry center, and they also produce lots of crop and stuff. So they are not producing as much wheat as they used to. So do people talk about that? This is the one question. The second one is, so since this bread is subsidized by government, so it means that these bakeries are getting like at least 100 piastre per bread from government.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think is it possible to make any sort of corruption? Like, for example, they didn't sell it, but they sold it, and they're getting this money from government,
Yeah.
and that's why they're having shortage of bread, even though it's subsidized.
Yeah, lots of possibilities for that. And that was another thing that these reforms were trying to cut down on. So before, the bakeries that were producing this bread would be given cheap flour, so they would be given the flour at the low price, and then they could produce it and sell it at the low price. But then what they found was that some bakers would take that flour and use it to make fancy bread or biscuits that they could sell at a much higher price. So there was the politics that was talking about was leakage. So there was quite a lot of kind of corruption in those instances. And then now with the system, how it works is that they have to buy flour at the market price, and then they reclaim back from the government per unit sold. So in theory, the smart card is meant to cut down on corruption because you've got the electronic log of exactly how many loaves they've sold, and then they can be reimbursed by loaf. But as you kind of guess, there are always possibilities for tweaking things. So there are always possibilities for logging a slightly different number of loaves being sold, or tweaking the system. So it's still going on, but I think it probably has been cut down since these changes from the subsidy.
Why not the government? I mean, does government produce bread too? Because in some countries, like for example Turkey, there is this thing halk ekmek, like bread for people. So government has this fabricates, or some municipalities, they produce bread and have some certain sale point and they sell it directly.
Very small.
Okay.
Like minuscule compared to these small-scale bakeries, which is quite interesting. I mean, like the army produces a little bit. Like there are a couple of like bigger bakeries, but by far the most production is done in these tiny little bakeries.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So yes, there's definitely possibilities of corruption. Then your first, a really interesting history. That longer history of Egypt used to be the kind of bread basket, and then you kind of saw this waxing and waning over the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. Associated with government policies which at sometimes tried to really promote export of wheat and other times tried to really kind of clamp down on it. But really like their kind of self-sufficiency rate has been going down since the kind of 1950s, 60s, despite a number of governments trying to kind of promote self-sufficiency. But it's largely about demand rather than Egyptian farmers. Like cotton doesn't compete with wheat because cotton is a summer crop. So actually the biggest competitors in terms of area of land are things like berberisine, which is a fodder crop, which is also pretty important for the livestock sector. Onions, which can be kind of quite a valuable kind of vegetable crop. So wheat is pretty widely cultivated. So their potential, what I'm trying to say is their potential for increasing their domestic production is pretty limited at the moment. So the fact that they can only produce a portion, it isn't so much that they are focusing on other crops, it's just that they can only produce so much.
Thank you so much. This was great. So I have a couple of questions about the red tape, or the bureaucratic red tape that you talked about, and Bitaqat al-Usra, right? And so it reminds me a little bit of the work of Hernando de Soto in terms of mapping the, how many steps an entrepreneur has to stop at to get a license to do something. So my question is that for me that really cries for a technological intervention. Graduate students, are you listening to this? Okay. So it cries for, so where is, it took 4 years, if I understood what you were saying, in terms of just, you get it, you're trying to fix it, of course. And it's also a story about technology and culture in this sense, in cultural practices and other things. So has there been an improvement in terms of the bitaqa? Why do I need actually to go through all those steps? Why don't they just fly by and then or out in a sense? So in terms of design, this is a question. I would like to talk to you about that actually after this. The other one is you use aish nashif. Right? So it's very interesting. In Morocco, we say khobz, we don't say it's aish. So symbolically, it's just unbelievable that you refer to bread that way. And then one thing that caught my eyes again as somebody from Morocco and a bread person myself, So what's the difference between baladi, I know what that means, baladi, shami, and fino, right? And the other one is, of course, where is barley in this discussion in terms of food security, if you want to use that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. So the first question about the technological intervention, I mean, I think that's what they were trying to do. They're trying to get all technological. The problems that Pfizer faced were all about the technology, you know, the barriers that it presented. So they're trying to kind of introduce more of a computerized system. But I think the problem in Egypt is that it's so patchy. You know, obviously you have some very highly sophisticated, you know, technological, you know, but certainly in the government, it's very patchy, and large parts of the government bureaucracy are still working with these papers, or they have like an internet connection that crashes, or computers that don't work. So I think that's the problem, maybe when you try and introduce that kind of system, and both you have quite a number of illiterate people who, or older people who can't quite cope with the system, and perhaps your facilities in the government, you know, aren't quite up there. But there's also politics here. So, you know, some of the early attempts to get a card, she was speaking with the head of a local tambourine store, like a local store that sold subsidised goods, who took her card, said, I'll get it working for you, and then she never got the card back. So there's quite a lot of, I think there's a lot of fuzziness around the edges where people are making some money too. Yeah. Which is in the interest then of various government bureaucrats not to make that clear. You know, that fuzziness is serving some people's, this fuzziness and the delays is serving some people's interests. Yeah. Shami, the Levantine bread, so it is like seen as is a whiter bread, it's more similar to the kind of bread you get in Syria and Lebanon. And the fino, it comes from Vienna, apparently, because it's like the kind of soft white rolls, they're sort of slightly sweet, back from the kind of colonial era. Yeah. Barley is used in some rural breads, but it's really kind of fallen out a lot of the bread. It's not so nearly so common anymore. There's no barley in the Aish Baladi, and in Fayoum they don't use barley at all. But there are some areas where they do still put barley in their bread. Yeah.
So the bitaqa is still the same to this day? Are they still using the same bitaqa al-usra?
Yeah.
Okay.
Same as from when? Since when? Same.
Since your timeline.
The picture.
Oh, I think it's the same, yeah.
It's the same.
Yeah, I think I might be wrong, but because I haven't been back in the last year, but
Okay.
it was the same last time I was there.
We will talk more
Yeah.
then,
I have a question. Considering that the example of FISA was in the late 2010s,
Yeah.
at this point, has there been any either national, federal government recognition of technological failures, or better yet, advancements in the technological efficiency? Has that progressed at all, or they even acknowledged their issues?
Not as far as I know. No. But I haven't done in-depth field work since then, so I might have missed something, but you know, I imagine that they're probably trying to improve the system, make certain improvements, partly because they actually want to shift. They have other visions of like how they might shift their subsidy program to make it, you know, to make it all kind of more financial. So they'll need to get to a certain level of kind of electronic documents to do that. So I should think people in the government are working on it, but I'd be surprised if it was that different.
Does everyone have access to the subsidized bread in Egypt?
No, you have to have one of these cards, and to get one of those cards, you need to meet some eligibility requirements, but they're pretty low. So most, you wouldn't. If you're very rich, if you're a rich businessman, you would not get one. But if you're a teacher or a government bureaucrat, about 70% of the population is still eligible. So the wages are so low in Egypt, the level of poverty is so high that actually the majority of the people still are eligible for it.
Thank you. I feel that the bread price is heavily subsidized. If something is so obviously heavily subsidized, that even it's a staple food, people would not cherish it.
Well, they do. They do, though. They do.
That's definitely.
Like they don't throw it away. Like I didn't see any evidence of that. Of people like treating it, because I think the larger symbolic significance, which is tied to religious, tied to all sorts of things. They do.
I was wondering, has anyone in Egypt has ever challenged this policy of long-term subsidizing staple food? Because for me, it looks like because I don't study food, but it looks like a very bad idea to overtly heavily subsidize a staple food. And I mean,
But bad
but
idea
the
for everyone.
intention is good. Intention is really good. But if you make something that is so against the market price, it will destroy the market.
Well, I think there is such an expectation now, like it's been subsidised for so long. I mean, an economist might agree with you.
Yes,
that is not how the government officials are thinking. Like, so there's it's not an economic decision here.
Yes.
It's a political, cultural decision that recognises that bread is so important to people. So we can cut down their fuel subsidies, we can do other things to make their lives miserable. But if you start making it so people can't eat, and then the level of poverty is so high that many people really can't afford hardly anything other than bread. So you start cutting that, and then you could your malnutrition rates could go kind of raising up. So it's not an economic decision.
Okay, thank you.
I have to talk to your advisor. This notion of the market.
There isn't a country in the world where there are very few where actual market prices, right, set the prices of these kinds of commodity products. This country certainly doesn't. I mean,
Right.
there's no free market.
Because you mentioned the subsidized price is 5 fish.
Yes.
5 fish is like nothing.
It's not money.
Yeah. Oh, it's not 20.
But even 20 is basically
20 is
enough. It's
basically
less than half a US cent.
Production
Yeah.
costs.
It's a political question, I think. I'm just
Yes,
so
yes, yeah, please.
Part of this is, it's a political in the
Yeah.
sense that from Nasser's time,
Yeah.
I think till now,
Yes.
they have been looking at this as a red line. Otherwise, people will not have the bread, so will get down to the streets and a revolution will
Yeah.
happen.
Oh.
A couple of
It's
times
a
they
political
have, correct,
Yeah.
that's why it's a security. It's a security in that sense.
Yes.
So that's one dimension. The second, about the phase that I think about your story and everything, this is tied to how many members are there in the household.
Mm-hmm.
And to issue these cards now, I think, it depends on how many members.
Yeah.
So it has to do with updating the database that the ministry, the Department of Social Security has at some point to approve how many loaves for each family.
That's sometimes one of the issues,
Yeah.
like when people have children or if someone dies or something like that. But in her case, it was because she didn't use it. So if you don't, it's predication on use. So if you don't use it a certain number of times, then it gets deactivated. So that's the thing.
Relating to the subsidy program, the big picture is the government, under a lot of pressure from the World Bank, has been doing something like this even with the bread, to push it from 5 to 20.
Yeah.
And it's expected to go up a bit gradually over time, because the World Bank has told Egypt repeatedly, we cannot really give you the loans if you are still depending on a so-called socialist economy
Yeah.
that has been subsidized by the government, not only in bread, but also for the oil production, gas,
Mhm.
different types of commodities.
Yeah.
Over time, I think this problem will be even worse, I think, because as you know, the Nile is under a lot of threat from the dam in Ethiopia now,
Mhm.
and it's affecting actually how much local wheat and grain is produced by Egyptians from the farmers. And this, how Egypt can find a solution to this problem, it's an ongoing conversation.
Mhm.
They tried to get to the Toshka project, which is a huge land in the desert, but its success was way minimal because of the government corruption. I think the president of Sisi now is getting back to the old
Yes.
book, trying to make the Toshka project succeed,
Yeah.
so it can already cut up for some of the exports that come mostly from Ukraine and Russia.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just a quick question, hopefully, what happened when they raised the price from 5 to 20? Was there not an explosion?
There was definitely not an explosion.
Yeah.
And I haven't been there back since then. I've been looking at the news to see if there definitely wasn't an explosion. So I was surprised that they did it. You sort of could imagine that they might have to at some place because of this
Right.
ongoing pressure. I mean, it's been decades. I mean, since the early 90s, the 80s, they've been saying, raise the price, raise the price. Well, the last price was in 89, so all through the 90s. But, I think I definitely don't think that means that people haven't been very bothered by it. I think it just means it's speaking to the current political situation in Egypt such that people don't feel that would be my guess. It would be very risky to try and organise any kind of protest over bread prices.
There is actually a fourth option that was not, I think, here, and it's tied to the social class. So we have the Aish Baladi,
Yeah,
and we have the Shami,
yeah.
and we have the fino,
Yeah.
we talked about.
Yeah,
The fourth one is الرغيف السياحي.
yeah.
It's called the tourist one.
Yeah.
And that's what it translates. And the tourist one is really produced by the private-owned bakeries, and it's more or less upper middle class. So if you are rich, you will go ahead and get these. They are big, high quality, and they are not subsidized. For some time, these ones, the relief belly has been tied only to certain classes. But what I have seen from my recent visits to Cairo, because of the economic situation, even the middle class families are getting back to their lunch.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's changing now based on the economic situation of the country.
And the government has intervened a little bit in some of those private sector breads, so they've put some price caps on even the siyahi and the shami bread.
The siyahi now, I think it's between 3 to 5 Egyptian pounds.
Seriously?
For one.
Okay, I tried to find out how much.
Yeah, 3 to 5.
Oh, wow.
It depends what you get. It's 3 to 5 Egyptian pounds per meal.
In dollars, please.
In dollars, divide by 50. So it's so low, but for an Egyptian, right, it's still big to get only one loaf.
And compared to the
for 3 to 5.
prices.
Right.
Possibility.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.